Imagine walking into a laboratory where the people inside aren't patients, volunteers, or prisoners awaiting treatment. They are simply considered material for an experiment. Their bodies are measured, their reactions recorded, and their suffering becomes data. This was not science fiction. During the Second World War, inside a heavily guarded complex in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a secret organization conducted some of the most horrific human experiments ever documented. It was known as Unit 731. Behind its walls, doctors and military researchers investigated disease, extreme temperatures, injuries, and biological weapons by experimenting on human beings. The people trapped there were denied the most basic protection, the right to be treated as human.
Welcome to Sleep Time. Relax your head, pull up your covers, and rest your mind. For tonight, we'll dive perhaps a bit too deep in the most sickening and horrifying true story we've uploaded yet. If you like these kinds of videos, please let me know in the comments below or by leaving a like on this video. So, let's get on with it. Unit 731 operated under the command of the Japanese Imperial Army, with its main facility established near the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria. Officially, the organization presented itself as a center for epidemic prevention and water purification. But behind that respectable language was a very different purpose. Researchers wanted to understand how infectious diseases could be weaponized, how the human body responded to extreme conditions, and how biological warfare might be used against enemy populations. The people used in these experiments were largely prisoners, including Chinese civilians and resistance suspects, along with others captured by Japanese authorities. Inside the facility, they were stripped of their identities and reduced to numbers.
The disturbing thing about Unit 731 was that it did not look like a place run by people who believed themselves to be monsters. Many of the researchers were trained physicians, surgeons, scientists, and military personnel. They understood anatomy. They understood infection. They understood how fragile the human body could be. And that is precisely what makes the story so disturbing. Scientific knowledge, when separated from ethics, can become something terrifying. The researchers weren't simply acting out of ignorance. They possessed knowledge and deliberately applied it to prisoners who had no ability to refuse. Their victims became unwilling test subjects in experiments designed to answer military questions.
One of the major areas of research was infectious disease. Researchers investigated illnesses including plague, cholera, typhoid, and other dangerous diseases. The goal was not simply to understand them. The military wanted to know whether disease could be cultivated, transported, and deliberately spread. Prisoners were infected, so researchers could observe how diseases developed inside the human body. Their symptoms were monitored, and in some cases, researchers performed dissections to examine the progression of disease. There was no meaningful consent, no independent medical oversight, and no possibility for the prisoners to withdraw. The experiment continued until the researchers had gathered the information they wanted.
Some experiments were designed around the basic question of how much punishment the human body could survive. Researchers exposed prisoners to extreme cold, particularly because they wanted information relevant to soldiers operating in freezing environments. People were placed in freezing conditions and monitored as their bodies deteriorated. Researchers observed changes in the limbs and circulation, searching for practical military information about frostbite and treatment. But there was a horrifying difference between legitimate medical research and what happened here. These weren't volunteers exposed to carefully controlled conditions with emergency treatment available. They were prisoners, deliberately subjected to severe suffering.
The cold experiments reveal something important about Unit 731. The purpose was often presented as scientific, but the methods completely rejected the principles that make medicine ethical. A legitimate experiment begins with a fundamental question. What harm is acceptable to obtain knowledge?
Unit 731 effectively erased that question. The prisoner had no meaningful choice. Their suffering was considered an acceptable cost. Once that principle was accepted, almost anything could be justified. Researchers could tell themselves that the information might save soldiers in the future, but the person suffering in front of them was no longer viewed as someone deserving protection. They had become a tool. Another terrifying aspect of Unit 731 was its research into wounds and physical trauma. Researchers wanted to understand what happened to the human body after severe injuries. Prisoners were subjected to procedures intended to replicate battlefield conditions. Some experiments involved surgery and other invasive procedures performed without normal medical safeguards. The researchers were attempting to gather information that could potentially be applied to military medicine. But there was a fundamental contradiction at the center of this research. Medicine exists to reduce suffering. Here, medical knowledge was being used to deliberately create suffering so that researchers could observe it.
Unit 731 also became involved in research connected to biological warfare. Researchers examined methods for producing and dispersing disease on a large scale. This transformed the experiments from individual acts of cruelty into something potentially much larger. If disease could be deliberately cultivated and spread, an enemy population could become a target without a conventional battlefield. Biological weapons offered the possibility of attacking people who weren't soldiers at all. The implications were enormous. A laboratory experiment could become a weapon capable of crossing borders, infecting communities, and killing people who had never even known they were part of a war.
The organization did not operate in complete isolation. Unit 731 was part of a broader network of Japanese military biological warfare programs. Other facilities and units participated in related research. This matters because it changes how we understand the crimes. They were not simply the actions of one isolated doctor working alone. They were connected to a military structure supported by resources, facilities, personnel, and a system that allowed the work to continue. The existence of that system meant that individual researchers could become part of something far larger than themselves. The responsibility, therefore, extended beyond the laboratory walls.
The victims were often referred to using dehumanizing language rather than their names. This wasn't accidental. Language can make terrible actions psychologically easier to perform. Once a person is reduced to an object, a number, or a category, the emotional barrier against harming them becomes weaker. This pattern appears throughout the history of human cruelty. The first step is often not physical violence. It is the removal of identity. Unit 731 demonstrates how dangerous that process can become when combined with scientific authority. A doctor holding a medical instrument should represent healing. Inside these facilities, the same instruments could become tools of experimentation. One of the most disturbing questions surrounding Unit 731 is how highly educated people became capable of participating in it. These were not people who lacked education. Some had studied medicine at respected institutions. They understood the scientific method. They understood disease. They understood the consequences of injury. Yet professional knowledge did not prevent them from committing atrocities. In some cases, it may even have made the experiments more systematic. That creates an uncomfortable lesson. Education alone does not make someone ethical. Intelligence does not automatically create compassion. Without moral boundaries, knowledge can be used to protect human life or to destroy it. The story becomes even darker when we look beyond the laboratory itself. Biological warfare was not purely theoretical. Japan conducted biological warfare operations during the war, and disease was deliberately used against Chinese populations. Plague-infected fleas and other biological agents were among the methods associated with these operations.
These attacks caused deaths and suffering far beyond the people imprisoned inside Unit 731. The laboratory and the battlefield became connected. What researchers learned through experiments could potentially be turned into weapons. The victims of experimentation, therefore, weren't necessarily the final victims. The consequences could extend into entire communities.
Yet for years, much of what happened remained hidden. When the war began to collapse for Japan in 1945, members of Unit 731 faced the possibility that their activities would be exposed. The facility was destroyed, and evidence was deliberately removed. Prisoners who remained were killed, and buildings were demolished. The goal was simple: leave as little behind as possible. But destroying a building does not necessarily destroy a crime. Survivors remembered. Families remembered. Documents survived in fragments. And eventually, investigators and historians began reconstructing what had happened behind the walls.
Then came one of the most controversial chapters of the story. After the war, some Unit 731 personnel were never prosecuted for their human experimentation. American authorities became interested in the information Japanese researchers had gathered about biological warfare. The Cold War was beginning, and biological weapons were becoming an important military concern. The pursuit of intelligence created an ethical dilemma. Should information obtained through horrific experiments be used by another government if it could provide military advantages? In the years after the war, some researchers avoided prosecution, and the full story remained obscure.
This is where the story stops being only about what happened during the experiments. It becomes a story about what happens afterward. Justice isn't simply about identifying the person who committed a crime. It is also about deciding what society does with the knowledge left behind. If information was obtained through torture, does using that information make the later user part of the crime? If scientists commit atrocities in the name of national security, should their research be preserved? These questions have no easy answers, but history becomes dangerous when uncomfortable questions are buried simply because the answers are inconvenient.
For decades, Unit 731 remained far less known internationally than many other wartime atrocities. Part of the reason was the secrecy surrounding the program and the destruction of evidence. Another reason was the political environment after the war. The emerging Cold War changed priorities. Former enemies became potential allies. Intelligence became valuable. And information about biological warfare was considered strategically important. The result was that some people connected to the program were able to return to civilian life. Some eventually held professional positions in medicine and academia. The distance between wartime crimes and post-war normality could be disturbingly small. But the victims did not have the luxury of simply moving on. Families in China continued to live with the consequences of biological warfare and wartime experimentation. Some communities experienced outbreaks connected to biological attacks. For survivors and descendants, this wasn't an abstract historical debate. It was part of family memory. This is one reason historical atrocities cannot be measured only by the number of bodies left behind. The damage continues through grief, fear, destroyed communities, and memories passed from one generation to another. The laboratory may disappear, but its consequences can remain for decades.
Unit 731 also forces us to confront the darker side of scientific progress. We often imagine science as a straight line toward improvement. More knowledge, better medicine, longer lives. But knowledge itself is morally neutral. What matters is how it is obtained and how it is used. A discovery can save lives, or it can become a weapon. A medical technique can heal a patient, or it can be used to understand how much suffering a human body can endure. The difference isn't always scientific. Sometimes it is simply whether society has decided that certain lines must never be crossed. After the war, the world attempted to establish stronger rules around human experimentation. The Nuremberg Code became one of the most important statements of medical ethics, emphasizing voluntary consent and the protection of human subjects. These principles emerged from a broader realization: scientific progress cannot justify treating human beings as disposable objects. Modern medical ethics would later develop much further, but the lesson remained fundamental. A person must not be sacrificed simply because researchers believe the information could benefit someone else. Without consent and protection, the experiment becomes exploitation.
What makes Unit 731 especially disturbing is that many of the questions the researchers wanted answered were legitimate scientific questions. How does disease progress? How does the body respond to extreme cold? How do injuries affect organs? How can infections spread? These are questions medicine genuinely needs to understand. The horror came from the method. Instead of studying disease through ethical research, they deliberately infected prisoners. Instead of studying battlefield injuries through safe models, they experimented on unwilling people. The scientific question did not justify the method. And that distinction is one of the most important lessons this story leaves behind. Today, the former site associated with Unit 731 has become a place of historical remembrance. Exhibitions, museums, documents, and testimony have helped bring parts of the story into public view. But the exact history remains complicated. Some evidence was destroyed. Some testimony was disputed. Political tensions influenced how the story was remembered. Researchers continue examining surviving records to determine what happened, who participated, and how extensive the program really was. History is rarely a perfect photograph. Sometimes it is a damaged collection of fragments, and reconstructing those fragments becomes part of the responsibility of remembering. There is also a danger in turning stories like this into simple tales of monsters. If we describe the perpetrators as completely inhuman, we can convince ourselves that ordinary people could never behave the same way. But that is exactly the lesson we should resist. The researchers were human beings. They had careers, families, ambitions, fears, and professional identities. They worked inside a system that gradually made cruelty acceptable. Understanding that doesn't excuse them. It makes the story more frightening, because it shows how ordinary human psychology can be manipulated when authority, ideology, fear, and ambition are combined.
The darkest experiment, then, wasn't just what happened to the prisoners. It was the experiment performed on the people conducting it. How far could professionals go if authority told them the victims didn't matter? How much suffering could become acceptable when it was labeled necessary? And how quickly could moral boundaries disappear when scientific language was used to justify violence? Unit 731 provides horrifying answers. The human body was treated as material. Pain became data. Death became an outcome. And the people responsible could convince themselves they were serving something larger than individual human life.
That is why the story of Unit 731 still matters. Not because it is the most shocking collection of experiments in history, but because it exposes a danger that doesn't belong to one country, one war, or one generation. Scientific knowledge without ethical limits can become destructive. Governments can justify terrible actions in the name of security. Professionals can become desensitized when institutions reward obedience. And ordinary people can be stripped of their humanity through language long before violence begins. The laboratory walls are gone. The equipment is gone. But the questions remain.
In the end, the darkest part of this story isn't a single experiment or a single room. It is the realization that human beings created a system where suffering could be measured, recorded, and justified as useful information.
The victims had names, families, hopes, and lives that mattered. The researchers had choices, and history remembers what happened when those choices were abandoned. Unit 731 is a reminder that the greatest danger of science isn't knowledge itself. It is what happens when knowledge becomes more important than the people it was supposed to serve. And sometimes, the most important experiment humanity can conduct is asking where the line must never be crossed. Good night, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more like this, please leave a like and comment on this video. Also, please consider subscribing. We'll see you next time on Sleep Time.